If you want your business to qualify for cyber insurance in 2026, these are the things you must have. Regardless of your industry, these controls are essential to be considered insurable and credible. Without them, your chances of obtaining coverage are extremely low. The list is extensive, so for you, I will outline them first before going into the details. Risk assessments, MFA enforcement, EDR, backups, patch management programs, employee training, incident response plan, list privilege, secured configuration, email and web security, vendor risk management, network segmentation, logging and monitoring, business continuity. So these are the controls. Now let's break down what each of these controls mean. Risk assessments. Risk assessment is a structured review of your systems, your data, and the processes to identify vulnerabilities and business risk. This is how you implement it. You want to use a standardized framework such as your NIST CyberSecurity framework, CIS controls, and the likes. You want to keep inventory of all hardware, software, and cloud services. You want to identify critical assets like your customer data, financial systems, and the IPs and such. You also want to document threats and their likelihood. You want to update quarterly or after every major changes. The second control we want to talk about is multi-factor authentication. What is it? It is a second verification step that you provide when you try to log in, when you're introducing yourself to the system you're logging into. Like we're familiar, you can get these from your apps, from like SMS messages, your hardware key even. It is required during login. Now you want to implement MFA by enforcing it on emails, on VPN, on admin accounts with privileges, on cloud applications. Use authenticator apps like your Microsoft Authenticator apps, Google Authenticator, and you want to require MFA on all remote access. You also want to disable legacy authentication protocols that you might have still hanging around. Now, the third control will be endpoint detection and response, or endpoint detection and recovery, EDR. What is it? It's an advanced monitoring that detects suspicious behavior on devices and then stops them in their tracks in real time. How do you implement this? You implement it by deploying EDR on all your devices, such as your laptops, your servers, your cloud workloads, everything that you have access to. You want to choose a reputable provider like your CrowdStrike, your Microsoft Defender, or SentinelOne. You want to set automated isolation, so rules for compromised devices are set to make the EDR do its work. It's automated. Now let's talk about the fourth control, regular data backup. It is when you make copies of critical data and you store those copies securely and separately from your main systems. You implement these by using what I like to call the 3-2-1 rule, where you make 3 copies of your data. You want to ensure you have 2 storage types for that data and you have 1 offsite storage location. You also want to make sure you include immutable backups. This will be backups that cannot be altered or deleted. You also want to test restoration on a monthly basis. Now let's talk about the 5th control, patch and vulnerability management. It is keeping software, operating systems, and devices updated to close any security gaps that might arise. Now, you do this implementation by enabling automatic updates wherever it's possible. You also want to patch critical vulnerabilities within 48 to 72 hours. You want to use a vulnerability scanner. The popular ones out there are like your Qualys, Rapid7, and then you have Tenable. Let's move on to the 6th control, employee security and awareness training. It is when you teach your employees how to recognize phishing and social engineering tactics. You also want to teach them how to spot any unsafe behavior. You do this implementation by conducting quarterly training sessions where you run phishing simulations. You provide clear reporting as well. So when they see something suspicious, they know where to report them to. You also want to ensure you train new hires as you employ them. You want to make sure the new hires are trained during their onboarding session. Control number 7, incident response plan. What is that? It is a documented step-by-step plan for responding to cyber incidents as you find them. You want to implement this by defining the roles like your IT lead, communications, legal, and leadership. You want to define those roles. You also want to create procedures for containment and for investigation and for recovery. You want to store incident response plans copies. You want to store them offline. You want to run tabletop exercises at least twice a year. The 8th control is access control and least privilege. This is when you ensure employees only have access to the data and systems that they need to do their jobs. You want to do the implementation by removing any admin rights from everyday accounts. You also want to use role-based access control, RBAC. You want to review permissions at least every quarter. You also want to disable accounts immediately when employees leave your employ. Now let's move on to control number 9, secure configuration and hardening. This is when you lock down your systems from your servers, your laptops, your Internet of Things devices as well. Every device you have on the network, you want to make sure they are locked down to reduce the attack surface. And you do the implementation by disabling like the unused ports, unused services, and unused accounts that's present on these devices. You also want to enforce strong password policies. You want to use encrypted storage on all your devices. You want to apply things like the CIS benchmark for system hardening. Let's move on to control number 10, email and web security controls. This is when you have tools that block phishing. The tools will block malware and malicious websites as employees click on links to visit those malicious destinations. How do you implement this into your network? You want to implement them by enabling spam filtering and attachment scanning. You also want to use DNS filtering to block risky domains. You also want to enable DMARC, DKIM, SPF for email authentication. You also want to monitor for spoofing attempts on the network. Now let's move on to control number 11, vendor and third-party risk management. It is evaluating the security of your partners, evaluating the security of your suppliers and your software providers. To do this implementation, you would need to maintain a list of all vendors with access to your data. You would require them to have SOC 2 or ISO 27001 reports. They provide that to you. That way you can be sure they are in compliance. You also want to include security clauses in your contracts that will be in your favor. You also want to review vendor access at least once a year. Control number 12, network segmentation. This is separating your system so attackers can move freely across your network. Implementation for this is done by separating things like your guest Wi-Fi from your internal systems. You also want to segment your departments like your finance, your HR, your production. You want to separate those networks from your main production networks. You also want to use things like your firewall between those segments. You also want to restrict lateral movements with zero trust principles enabled already. Control number 13, that will be logging and monitoring. This is where you collect and review system logs to detect suspicious activity as they happen across your network. Implementation for this is done by centralizing your logs in a SIEM solution like your Splunk, like your QRadar, or your Microsoft Sentinel. You want to retain logs for at least 12 months. You also want to monitor admin activity very closely. Set your alerts for unusual behavior. Now let's move on to control number 14. Very important. Business continuity and disaster recovery. This is when you make plans to keep operations running during and after a cyber incident. Implementation for this is done by identifying critical business functions. Create recovery time objectives, your RTOs. You want to document alternative workflows. You want to test recovery procedures at least once a year. Now let's move on to industry-specific recommendations that are practical and focused. We begin with healthcare. Healthcare, you want to make sure you're prioritizing your endpoint detection and recovery on all clinical devices. You want to make sure you have strong access control for personal health information. You want to make sure your network is segmented. The segmentation has to be between your medical equipment and your admin systems. You also want to ensure you have vendor risk management for your electronic health record providers. Now let's move on to finance and banking. For finance and banking, you want to make sure you have continuous monitoring and you have your security information and event management, that is your SIEM. You want to make sure those are there. You also want to make sure you have strict MFA and privileged access controls enabled. You also want to look out for quarterly penetration testing. You also want to do strong encryption for all data that is in transit and the data that is at rest. For the retail and e-commerce business, you want to prioritize PCI compliant payment systems. You want to prioritize web application firewalls, and you want to make sure your email security is set up to prevent invoice fraud. Now, we want to also make sure rapid patching is enabled for all your POS systems. For the SaaS and tech startup businesses, you want to prioritize endpoint detection and recovery on your on-prem as well as on your cloud workloads. You want to make sure your DevOps environment is secure. You want to ensure your API security is reviewed. You also want to ensure you have strong identity management. So your single sign-on and your MFA, you want to make sure they are properly identified and integrated. Let's move on to manufacturing and industrial types of businesses. You see, for these types of businesses, you want to make sure you are prioritizing network segmentation, especially between operational technology and information technology. You also want to ensure you have offline and immutable backups readily available. You want to ensure you have physical security controls in place. You also want to make sure you are monitoring for unauthorized remote access. As you can see, the 14 controls listed are comprehensive and the industry-specific recommendations are highly practical. If your business implements them effectively, you'll be viewed as a highly desirable and low-risk candidate by cyber insurance providers. I hope this helps you make the right decision for your business. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be ready to respond and answer any questions. Remember, the strongest shield is an informed mind. Stay sharp, stay curious, and stay ready.